The brick walls glowed orange in the firelight, while the blizzard outside screamed at 70 miles per hour. But Stellan Voss sat comfortably in his cabin with the fire burning low. 3 miles away, Ephraim Lund huddled against his cast-iron stove, feeding it the last scraps of furniture because the whiteout had made his woodpile unreachable 2 days ago. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is even more unbelievable than this one. October 1842 came to the Montana Rockies with unexpected violence. Stellan Voss woke to wind hammering the log walls of the cabin he shared with Amos Keir, and he knew immediately that something had changed in the weather. The temperature had dropped 30 degrees overnight. He could see his breath inside the cabin despite the cast-iron stove still holding remnants of the previous night's fire. Amos was already awake, feeding split pine into the stove. The metal box sat on 4 iron legs directly on the cabin's packed earth floor, exactly like every other trapper's stove across the Rocky Mountain region. It weighed perhaps 120 pounds, stood 18 inches tall, and had served them adequately for 7 seasons of partnership. "Early storm," Amos said without turning from the stove. He was 38 years old, a Scotsman who had come west in 1835 with nothing but a rifle and enough stubbornness to survive the wilderness that killed softer men. "We should check the trap lines before it gets worse." Stellan pulled on his wool coat and stepped outside. The sky was the color of old iron, and snow was already falling in thick, heavy flakes that meant serious accumulation. The thermometer nailed to the cabin wall read 8 degrees. In October. He had seen cold snaps before, but nothing this severe this early in the season. They spent the day working their beaver traps along the creek that ran through the valley below their camp. The work was brutal in the wind and cold, but beaver pelts commanded premium prices in St. Louis, and a man didn't survive in the mountains by avoiding discomfort. By the time they returned to the cabin at dusk, 4 inches of new snow covered the ground, and the temperature had dropped to -5 degrees. Inside, Amos rebuilt the fire while Stellan prepared a meal of salt pork and cornmeal mush. The stove radiated heat into the small space, and within an hour the cabin felt almost comfortable. Almost. Cold air seeped through gaps in the log chinking, and the packed earth floor remained perpetually cold beneath their feet. Heat rose from the stove and collected near the ceiling while the lower half of the cabin stayed stubbornly chilly. "We'll need to feed this every few hours tonight," Amos observed, nodding toward the stove. "Temperature still dropping." They took shifts. Stellan fed the fire at 10 in the evening, adding 3 split logs. Amos woke at midnight and added more. Stellan's turn came again at 2 in the morning. He rose from his bedroll, shivering despite being fully clothed, and realized the cabin temperature had dropped dramatically. The fire had burned down to coals. He added wood quickly, but it took 20 minutes for the new logs to catch properly and begin radiating significant heat. At 4 in the morning, Amos shook him awake. Something was wrong. "Stellan, I can't get warm." The cabin was freezing. The fire had burned low again despite Amos having fed it less than 2 hours earlier. Stellan stumbled to the stove and saw the problem immediately. Wind was infiltrating through every gap in the cabin walls, creating drafts that swept across the floor and robbed heat from the stove. The metal box was warm to the touch, but the moment heat radiated outward, the moving air carried it away. He built up the fire frantically, adding log after log until flames filled the firebox, but Amos was already shaking uncontrollably. Hypothermia had set in. By dawn, Amos Keir was dead. Stellan buried Amos on a hillside overlooking the creek where they had worked their trap lines together for 7 seasons. The ground was already frozen 2 inches deep, and he spent an entire day breaking through it with a pickaxe before the grave was deep enough. He piled stones over the site to keep scavengers away and stood there as the sun set behind the mountains, trying to understand what had happened. The question wouldn't leave him alone. Why had Amos died? Other trappers would have called it bad luck, early storm, unexpected cold, the dangers of mountain life that every man accepted when he chose this existence. But Stellan couldn't accept that answer because he had survived the same night in the same cabin, breathing the same cold air, and the only difference was timing. Amos had been awake during the coldest hours. Amos had been moving around, burning energy, unable to generate enough warmth to compensate for what the cabin was stealing from his body. The stove had failed them. That was the truth Stellan couldn't escape. He spent the next 3 days reconstructing the night in meticulous detail. He recorded temperatures every hour. He measured how much wood they had burned compared to a normal night. He watched how the fire behaved during wind gusts, how the flames bent and struggled when cold air rushed through the gaps in the cabin walls. He observed the way heat rose immediately to the ceiling while the floor stayed cold enough to hurt his bare feet. The cast iron stove weighed 120 pounds. When the fire inside burned hot, the metal heated up and radiated warmth into the cabin. But the moment the fire died down, the metal cooled rapidly. There was no heat storage. The stove was simply a metal box that transferred the fire's warmth into the air, and the moment you stopped feeding it, the warmth disappeared. Stellan did calculations with a pencil stub on a piece of birch bark. During the night Amos died, they had burned approximately twice the normal amount of wood. They had fed the fire every 2 hours instead of every 4, and still the cabin had nearly frozen. The stove wasn't just inefficient, it was inadequate for the conditions they faced. He thought about the drafts constantly. Cold air flowed across the floor like an invisible river, drawn in through every gap in the walls and flowing toward the stove where rising heat created a vacuum. The stove sat directly in this current, 18 inches above the floor, fully exposed. Every bit of heat it produced was immediately attacked by moving cold air. Winter deepened, and Stellan stayed in the mountains when other trappers headed to lower elevations or back to civilization. He couldn't leave, not yet. He needed to understand the problem completely before he could think about solutions. His trap lines went unchecked. His supplies dwindled. He spent his days studying the stove, the cabin, the way heat and cold interacted in this small space that had killed his partner. Other trappers stopped by occasionally, offering condolences and puzzled by his refusal to leave. It was bad luck, Stellan, Thaddeus Holmgren told him in late November. Could have happened to anyone. But it wasn't luck. It was physics. It was engineering. It was a solvable problem, and Stellan was going to solve it. He started paying attention to how other cabins were built when he visited neighboring camps. He saw the same design everywhere. Cast iron stoves sitting on floors, fires burning at floor level, heat escaping through roofs, while cold air dominated the lower space where people actually lived and slept. Everyone accepted this as normal. No one questioned whether there might be a better way. By the time spring arrived in 1843, Stellan had filled his mind with observations and his birch bark sheets with calculations. He knew what had failed. Now he needed to learn what might succeed. Stellan sold his winter furs in St. Louis in June of 1843 and made a decision that puzzled every trapper who knew him. Instead of buying supplies and returning to the mountains, he stayed in civilization. He had questions that needed answers, and those answers wouldn't be found in the wilderness. He spent 2 weeks walking through St. Louis studying buildings. He examined brick warehouses and noted how the walls retained warmth even after the sun went down. He watched masons working on a new hotel and paid attention to how they laid courses of brick with careful precision. He asked questions until the workers grew tired of him. Then he moved on to the next construction site. In Independence, Missouri, he found what he was looking for. A German immigrant named Friedrich ran a masonry business, and his home featured something Stellan had never seen before. A brick heating stove that stood floor to ceiling in the main room, massive and strange and utterly different from the cast iron boxes trappers used. It is called a Kachelofen, Friedrich explained in heavily accented English. "My father built such stoves in Bavaria. This one I built myself when I came here." Stellan watched Friedrich load wood into a small firebox at the base of the structure. The fire burned hot and fast for 2 hours, then died down to nothing, but the house stayed warm. He put his hand against the brick surface and felt heat radiating steadily. "How long does it stay warm?" Stellan asked. 12 hours, sometimes 14 if I fire it properly." "The brick holds the heat." "Yes. Brick is mass. Mass stores energy. Your American iron stoves, they are clever, yes, but they have no mass. The heat escapes immediately." Friedrich tapped the brick wall of his stove. "This weighs perhaps 2,000 pounds. All of that weight becomes warm. All of that weight releases heat slowly." Stellan spent 3 days with Friedrich learning everything the mason could teach him. He learned that thermal mass was predictable. A pound of brick could store a specific amount of heat energy. The more brick you had, the more heat you could store. He learned that the fire needed to be surrounded by the thermal mass, not just sitting near it. Contact was everything. He learned about draft management, about how combustion chambers could be designed to protect fire from moving air. He learned about mortar ratios and brick selection and the importance of even courses that distributed weight properly. But he also learned that he couldn't simply copy a European masonry heater. Those structures were massive, required expert mason skills, and took weeks to build even with experienced workers. Stellan needed something simpler, something a man could build alone in the mountains with basic tools. Something that combined the thermal mass principle with the practicality of frontier life. He bought a notebook and began sketching. The design that emerged over the following weeks was a hybrid. A sunken fire cavity lined with brick. A platform of thermal mass rising above it. A standard cast iron stove box sitting on top. Removable for access but heated from below by fire surrounded by brick. It wasn't elegant, but it might work. Stellan returned to Independence in late July and placed an order that made the kiln operator laugh. 230 bricks. Each one weighed 4.5 pounds, which meant he was purchasing over 1,000 pounds of fired clay to haul into the Rocky Mountains. "You building a house up there?" the operator asked. "Something like that," Stellan replied. He also bought lime for mortar, a mason's trowel, a level, and 2 heavy iron handles that a blacksmith modified to his specifications. The total cost consumed most of his fur money from the previous season. He loaded 75 bricks onto 2 pack mules and began the first of 3 trips that would define his reputation among the trapping community. The journey took 9 days. The mules struggled with the weight, and Stellan had to rest them frequently. On the 5th day, he encountered Thaddeus Holmgren coming down from the mountains with his spring catch. Thaddeus stared at the brick-laden mules for a long moment. "Stellan, why are you hauling bricks?" "I need them." "For what?" "A project." Thaddeus shook his head slowly. "Amos died, and you've gone strange. You know that, right?" Stellan didn't answer. He urged the mules forward and continued up the mountain trail. Behind him, he heard Thaddeus laughing. The second trip came in September, 80 bricks this time, plus the lime and tools. He encountered Enoch Farrow at a trading post near Fort Benton, and word had already spread. "Heard you're hauling bricks," Enoch said. "That true?" "It's true." "What in God's name for?" "I'm building something." Enoch leaned against the trading post wall and studied Stellan with open amusement. "Heard you're building a mansion. That what this is? You getting civilized up there?" "Just a stove." "A stove needs bricks like a rifle needs a feather pillow." Enoch grinned. "You've lost your sense, Voss." The third trip happened in October, as the first snow began to fall. 75 more bricks plus the iron handles. Stellan encountered Soren Brandt on the trail, and Soren didn't even ask questions. He just looked at the loaded mules and shook his head. "Man's lost his mind after his partner froze," Soren said to his own companion, loud enough for Stellan to hear clearly. "Hauling bricks like they're gold. Next he'll be hauling a piano." Stellan made camp that night beside a creek and stacked the bricks carefully on a canvas tarp. 3 trips, 3 months of work. 1,035 pounds of brick, now sitting at his campsite, along with every other material he needed. He had sketched the design so many times he could build it in his sleep. The sunken cavity, the thermal mass platform, the removable stove box on top. Tomorrow he would begin construction. Let them laugh. Let them call it folly. Amos had died because their stove had no thermal mass, no draft protection, no capacity to store heat through the coldest hours. Stellan was going to build something better, even if he built it alone. Stellan built the cabin walls first, following standard Rocky Mountain construction. Logs notched at the corners, chinked with moss and clay, a single door facing south. The work took 4 weeks, and it gave him time to refine his plan for the heating system that would sit at the cabin center. Before installing the floor, he marked out the location carefully. 28 inches wide, 24 inches deep, positioned where it would provide maximum heat distribution to the single-room cabin. Then he began digging. The depression needed to be 8 inches below what would become the floor level. He excavated carefully, removing soil and rocks until he had a rectangular pit that matched his specifications exactly. Other trappers would have laughed. At the precision, Stellan didn't care. Every measurement mattered. Thaddeus Holmgren arrived on the 3rd day of excavation and stood in the doorway watching Stellan work with a pickaxe and shovel. "You're digging a hole in your floor," Thaddeus observed. "Yes." "Why?" "Draft protection. The fire will burn below floor level, shielded from air movement." Thaddeus scratched his beard. "Fire burns fine at floor level. Been burning that way for 1,000 years." "Fire burns inefficiently at floor level," Stellan replied, not looking up from his work. "Cold air flows across floors. It robs heat from the combustion. A recessed fire chamber eliminates that problem." "You're using a lot of words that don't mean anything up here." Stellan drove the pickaxe into the hard soil and looked at Thaddeus directly. "Amos died because our stove couldn't store heat. I'm building something that will." Thaddeus's expression shifted slightly. He nodded once and left without another word. The bottom of the depression received a layer of flat stones, carefully fitted together to create a stable base. Stellan mixed his first batch of mortar, combining lime, sand, and water according to the ratios Friedrich had taught him. The mixture was stiff and difficult to work, but he learned by doing, adjusting the proportions until it held properly. He laid the first course of bricks along the bottom of the depression. Each brick was placed carefully, mortar spread evenly beneath it, checked with the level before moving to the next. The work was slow. He had never laid brick before, and every joint had to be perfect. The 3 walls of the fire cavity took shape over the next week. Back wall and 2 side walls rising from the depression floor to what would become floor level. The front remained open, providing access for fuel loading. Stellan worked alone, checking measurements constantly, rebuilding sections when they didn't meet his standards. Enoch Farrow and Soren Brandt arrived together in mid-November. They stood in the unfinished cabin, staring at the brick-lined depression. "Bridger's Brick Folly," Enoch announced. "That's what everyone's calling it." Soren laughed. "Could have bought 3 good stoves for what you spent on this." Stellan troweled mortar onto another brick and didn't respond. He had stopped trying to explain. The work would speak for itself, eventually. The fire cavity was complete by late November, and Stellan began building upward. The brick courses rose above what would become the cabin floor level, creating the thermal mass platform that would transform fire into stored heat. Each course had to cure before he could add the next, and winter cold slowed the process. Some days he could only lay 1 course. Other days the mortar wouldn't set properly, and he had to wait. He worked by firelight in the evenings, checking each joint with his level, scraping away excess mortar, ensuring every brick sat perfectly aligned with those below it. The platform extended, 7 inches beyond the fire cavity on all sides, creating a stable base for the stove box that would eventually sit on top. By early December, The structure stood 11 inches above floor level. The total vertical span from the bottom of the sunken cavity to the top of the platform measured 19 inches. Approximately 190 bricks had gone into the construction, creating a thermal mass that weighed over 800 pounds. Stellan ran his hand across the flat platform surface and felt satisfaction for the first time since Amos had died. This would work. Fire burning in the cavity below would heat brick on 4 sides. That brick would absorb thermal energy and release it slowly over hours. The mass would act as a battery, storing heat when the fire burned hot and radiating it back when the fire died down. Thaddeus arrived with 2 other trappers in mid-December. They stood in the doorway without entering, staring at the brick structure that dominated the small cabin. "You spent 3 months on this," Thaddeus said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. Could have built 2 cabins in that time. I don't need 2 cabins." One of the other trappers, a man named Caleb, shook his head. "What's wrong with a regular stove? One that sits on the floor like everybody else uses?" Stellan set down his trowel. Floor-level fires are exposed to drafts. Cold air movement robs combustion efficiency. This design places the fire in a protected cavity. The brick surrounding it captures heat that would otherwise escape. When the fire burns down, the thermal mass continues radiating warmth. Caleb looked at Thaddeus. "He's using those fancy words again." Enoch Farrow appeared behind them. "Heat rises anyway. Why sink it down into a hole? You're fighting nature, Voss." Stellan had explained thermal mass principles a dozen times to a dozen different trappers. None of them understood because none of them wanted to understand. They saw excessive labor, wasted resources, city thinking applied to mountain problems. They didn't see the physics. "The stove box will sit on this platform," Stellan explained anyway, gesturing to the flat brick surface. "Fire burns below it. Heat rises through the brick before reaching the metal. Every bit of thermal energy passes through mass that stores it." Thaddeus studied the structure for a long moment. "If this works, I'll eat my hat." "And if it doesn't?" Enoch asked. "Then Voss wasted a season building the most expensive grave marker in the Rockies." Enoch grinned, for his own common sense. They left laughing. Stellan returned to his mortar and bricks. The platform was finished. Now he needed the stove box. Stellan traveled to Fort Benton in early January of 1844. The trading post sat 3 days' journey from his cabin, and he arrived with precise measurements written on a piece of birch bark. He needed a cast iron stove box with specific dimensions and custom modifications that no standard manufacturer provided. The trader looked at his specifications. 26 inches wide, 20 inches deep, 15 inches tall. I can order that. But why do you need handles on the sides? The stove box needs to be removable. Stoves don't move. That's why they're stoves. This one does. The trader shrugged. Your money. He consulted a catalog from a foundry in Pittsburgh. 8 weeks for delivery. Maybe 10 if the river's frozen. Stellan paid half in advance and returned to his cabin to wait. He spent the time gathering firewood, cutting enough to last 2 winters. Something about the previous autumn had felt different. Old trappers at the fort had mentioned it. Bad winter coming. Maybe the worst in memory. The stove box arrived in late March, hauled up from Fort Benton on a freight wagon. It weighed 90 pounds, and the blacksmith at the fort had added the heavy iron handles exactly as Stellan had requested. 2 handles, one on each side, bolted through the cast iron walls. Stellan carried it back to his cabin and placed it on the brick platform. The fit was perfect. The stove box sat centered on the thermal mass, with brick visible on all sides. He installed the chimney pipe, running it through a careful opening he had cut in the roof. Then he built the first fire. He placed kindling and small logs in the sunken brick cavity below the stove box. The fire caught quickly, flames rising within the protected depression. He fed larger pieces of wood gradually, watching how the combustion behaved in its recessed chamber. The flames burned steadily undisturbed by the minor drafts that swept across the cabin floor 8 inches above. Heat began radiating from the fire, and the surrounding brick absorbed it. Stellan placed his hand against the platform surface and felt it warming slowly. This was the critical element. The brick wasn't just decoration. It was a thermal battery charging itself with energy from the flames below. 3 hours after lighting the fire, the entire brick structure felt warm to the touch. The cabin temperature had risen to comfortable levels, and Stellan hadn't fed the fire aggressively. He added wood at a measured pace, maintaining steady flames rather than the roaring fires that standard stoves required. As evening approached, he let the fire burn down to coals. This was the test. With a conventional stove, the cabin would begin cooling immediately. He sat on his bedroll and waited. The brick continued radiating heat. An hour after the flames died, the platform still felt warm. 2 hours later, warmth still emanated from the thermal mass. The cabin temperature dropped slowly, gradually, nothing like the rapid cooling he had experienced with the cast-iron stove that had failed him and Amos. 9 hours after the fire died completely, the brick still held enough heat to keep the cabin above freezing. The system worked exactly as designed. Spring of 1844 brought successful trapping. Stellan worked his beaver lines and accumulated pelts that would bring good prices in St. Louis. His cabin became a known landmark among the scattered trapping community, the fortress, some called it. Voss's brick palace, others said. The mockery had softened into routine jokes, the kind men made about harmless eccentricities rather than genuine foolishness. Summer passed with maintenance work and preparation. Stellan gathered firewood with unusual dedication, cutting and stacking cords beyond what normal winters required. He repaired the cabin's chinking and reinforced the door. He couldn't explain the feeling, but something about the changing seasons felt different. September brought unusually cold weather. Early snows dusted the high peaks, and the aspen leaves turned gold 2 weeks ahead of schedule. Old trappers at Fort Benton mentioned it in low voices. Bad winter coming. Animals were growing thicker coats. Birds were migrating early. The signs were there for anyone paying attention. Leif Thorsen arrived at Stellan's cabin in early October. He was a Norwegian trapper, 28 years old, newer to the mountains than most. He had heard about the brick heating system and wanted to see it himself. Stellan showed him everything. The sunken fire cavity, the thermal mass platform. He demonstrated the removable stove box, lifting it by the handles to reveal the fire chamber below. "Why does it need to come off?" Leif asked. "Cleaning. And emergency fuel loading if conditions get bad enough that opening the front becomes problematic." Leif ran his hand along the brick surface. "How long does it stay warm after the fire dies?" 9 to 10 hours. Sometimes longer if I fire it properly before letting it burn down. "And you built this because your partner froze?" "I built this because our stove had no thermal mass. When the fire died, the heat disappeared immediately. This stores energy. It gives you time." Leif nodded slowly. He didn't mock. He didn't dismiss. He studied the construction with genuine interest and asked technical questions about mortar ratios and brick placement. When he left, he thanked Stellan seriously. November brought more early snow. Thaddeus Holmgren stopped by and mentioned, almost casually, "Maybe your brick thing isn't completely stupid. Been thinking about heat storage. Makes a kind of sense." It was the closest thing to an apology Stellan would receive. Soren Brandt arrived in late November with concerning news. "Ephraim Lund's worried about his wood supply. Says he didn't cut enough last summer. I told him he's probably fine, but he's nervous." December arrived with bitter cold. Temperatures dropped to -20 degrees by the 10th of the month and stayed there. The sky took on a peculiar flat gray color that old trappers recognized. Storm coming. Big one. Stellan checked his firewood supply and made sure his cabin was sealed tight. The brick structure sat ready in the center of the room, 800 pounds of thermal mass waiting to prove itself. He had built it for Amos, for the future, for survival. He didn't know that in 8 days it would save his life. The storm arrived on December 18, 1844. Stellan woke to wind that sounded like artillery fire against the cabin walls. Snow fell so thick he couldn't see 10 feet beyond the door. The thermometer read -20 degrees at dawn. By afternoon it had dropped to -35. He built a fire in the sunken cavity and settled in to wait. The flames burned steadily in their protected depression, undisturbed by the drafts that swept across the cabin floor above. He fed wood every 5 hours, maintaining consistent heat rather than the desperate constant feeding that standard stoves required. Day 2 brought winds that exceeded 60 miles per hour. The entire cabin shook. Snow forced itself through invisible gaps in the walls, creating small drifts in the corners. Visibility outside was absolute zero. Stellan could hear trees snapping in the forest. The temperature fell to -40 degrees. His brick structure radiated steady warmth. He let the fire burn down overnight, and the thermal mass kept the cabin at 38 degrees until morning. Comfortable enough under blankets, survivable without question. 3 miles southwest, Ephraim Lund was burning through his wood supply at an alarming rate. His cast-iron stove sat on the cabin floor, fully exposed to the drafts that hurricane-force winds drove through every gap in his walls. The fire struggled constantly. Cold air swept across the stove and robbed heat before it could warm the cabin. He fed wood every 90 minutes just to maintain minimal temperature. Day 3 brought -45 degrees. The storm showed no signs of weakening. Stellan's cabin remained survivable. He used perhaps half his normal wood consumption. The brick mass absorbed heat during burns and released it for hours afterward. He never felt truly cold. Ephraim's accessible firewood ran out. The pile outside his door sat 15 feet away, but visibility was zero, and the wind chill made exposure fatal within minutes. He began burning furniture, a chair, the table, sections of his sleeping platform, anything combustible. Day 4, Stellan maintained his routine, feeding the fire every 5 hours, letting the brick do its work between burns. He ate calmly and slept comfortably. The system performed exactly as designed. Ephraim's fire consumed his last pieces of furniture. He tried to reach the outdoor woodpile, made it perhaps 10 feet into the whiteout before the cold drove him back inside. His hands were frostbitten from that brief exposure. Day 5. The fire in Ephraim's stove died. The cabin reached 0 degrees within 3 hours. Ephraim Lund froze to death, wrapped in every blanket he owned, 15 feet from a woodpile he couldn't reach. Day 6. The storm began to break. Winds decreased. Visibility improved slightly. Day 7. Clear skies, -30 degrees, but -30 calm. Stellan emerged from his cabin and began checking on neighbors. He found Ephraim frozen in his cabin, surrounded by the shattered remains of furniture he had burned trying to survive. 5 miles north, Micah Strand was found similarly dead. Then another, then another. The final count reached 11 dead across the region, all in cabins with standard cast-iron stoves. Stellan Voss had burned half his normal wood and never been in danger. The survivors gathered at Fort Benton in late December. 11 bodies had been recovered from cabins across the region. The stories were identical. Standard stoves that couldn't maintain heat during sustained extreme cold. Trappers who ran out of accessible firewood when whiteout conditions made leaving the cabin fatal. Fires that died and cabins that froze within hours. Leif Thorsen found Stellan near the trading post. "Your cabin. How much wood did you burn?" "Maybe half what I normally use in a week of cold weather." The silence that followed carried weight. Other trappers listened. No one apologized for the mockery. No one admitted they had been wrong. But the joke stopped completely. Thaddeus Holmgren approached 2 days later. "The brick cavity, the thermal mass platform. Would you show me how you built it?" Stellan spent 3 hours explaining the construction, measurements, mortar ratios, the importance of the sunken fire chamber for draft protection, the weight of brick required for adequate heat storage. Thaddeus listened carefully and took notes on paper he had bought specifically for this conversation. "I'm rebuilding my cabin this spring," Thaddeus said. "I'm doing it your way." By spring of 1845, Leif Torsen was constructing his own version at his trap site 40 miles north. He made modifications based on available materials, but the core principles remained: sunken fire cavity, brick thermal mass, removable stove box on top. Summer brought Soren Brandt to Stellan's cabin with questions about brick sourcing and platform dimensions. He built his own that autumn, finishing before the first snow. He called it a practical improvement, never acknowledging his previous mockery. By winter of 1846, 7 cabins in the region featured what trappers were calling sunken hearth construction, or Voss box designs. The terminology varied, but the principle spread organically. Men who had survived explained it to men who were building new cabins. The knowledge transferred through demonstration and conversation, never formally documented, simply shared as practical wisdom. The winter of 1846 brought another severe storm. No one died. The cabins with thermal mass heating systems kept their occupants alive on reduced wood consumption. The design had proven itself twice. By the 1850s, sunken stove construction had become standard practice in high-altitude Rocky Mountain cabins. Trappers, hunters, and early settlers all recognized the advantage. Brick was heavy. Brick was, and expensive to transport, but death was permanent. Men made the investment. Stellan continued trapping until 1858. He moved to a small ranch in Wyoming Territory in '59 and married a widow from Ohio. They had 2 children. He never spoke about the heating system he had designed. When neighbors asked about his past, he mentioned trapping and left it at that. He died in February of 1871 at the age of 61. Pneumonia took him quickly. His grave outside Laramie bore a simple marker with his name and dates. Nothing about innovation. Nothing about the cabins across the Rockies that still used his design. But in the mountains, brick structures built into cabin floors continued saving lives during the hardest winters. The innovation outlived its inventor by decades, preserved not in words but in mortar and clay and the warm survival of men who never knew Stellan Voss's name.